You are listening to Accents, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. I'm your host, Katerina Stoikova, and my guest today is poet, writer, translator, scholar, Harvey L. Hicks. Hi, Harvey. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Katerina.
Very excited to talk to you. Let me introduce you to our listeners with a few biographical notes that I chose from the many available. You are so accomplished. H.L. Hicks is the author of The Gospel According to H.L. Hicks, published by Broadstone Media. He is also the author of a poetry collection, Rain Inscription. Also, he has translated several books of poetry, edited anthologies, traveled and taught at various places around the world. So much to talk about, but let's start the conversation with the gospel.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
The gospel is a preoccupation of mine from childhood. I was raised in a household in which the gospel was very important. It was an evangelical Protestant household. And so, I heard the gospel at home, in church, but then in college, my understanding of what the gospel was and where it came from began to change. I didn't realize until I was in college that there were many gospels written, not just the four canonical gospels that are familiar: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so my own views have changed, and finally it occurred to me that the gospel, the writers of the canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, themselves had sources. They weren't reporting their personal experience. They were drawing on sources and taking from those sources and creating a single narrative. But what began to really be a presence for me was that we're not allowed to do that now. And so the gospels are so consistently presented as there are only four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or there are only four authentic ones, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're to be presented separately in sequence. And so what I wanted to try to do for myself was to ask, but what if I do the same thing that those gospel writers did? What would it look like? And so I found sources. There are a great many ancient gospels, not only those four, some newly discovered. And so I've just wanted to go and find those sources and do what those gospel writers did.
So you said, we are not allowed to do that now. And then you said, well, I decided to do that now. You said those two sentences very close, but did it take years? Was it a journey?
It took many years to get to that point of the decision to do this. So there was there's a time span of decades between my college sort of beginning to acquire different sources of knowledge about the canonical gospels in college than I had in the churches in which I was brought up. There's a time of decades between that process of beginning to understand that, oh, maybe the composition of the canonical gospels happened differently than I had taken for granted before. That the beginning of that awareness and my starting this project was, it really was a period of, what would it have been, 30 years or more before the process began. And then the process of actually, once the decision was made, the process was, it was give or take a year. It was a fortunate year because I had, because I was on sabbatical from my work. And so I could just devote everything, morning to night on this. It normally would have taken me much longer, but in that intense year, with some very fortunate support, I had a couple of residencies where I was able to just work with complete focus on the project.
So did you do the research during this year, before this year, or throughout all of the above?
The most active research, of course, there was a lot of research that preceded the decision. So, my interest in the Gospels is, as I say, long-standing. So some research done before that, but then most of the research was done after the decision was made. And there was an occasion for the decision. I think that moment, the moment of when the switch went on, there was an occasion because I was working on a different project, a poetry project, and wanted to read more about a relatively recent, in the scheme of things, discovery, what's usually referred to as the Nag Hammadi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Nag Hammadi find, which was discovered in Egypt. If I remember correctly, it was in the 40s. And then what was found was made available to scholars and others, I think in the 70s. So in that sense, recent discovery of a number of texts, they seem to have been gathered by someone who was affiliated with Gnosticism, and they seem to sort of cluster around that, but included some interesting things. So I got interested in this body of work that was new to me. I just, I had sort of vaguely heard of this body of work, but hadn't tried to investigate more actively. And when I began to really read in those, then it just occurred to me. It just, that the switch flipped, and it occurred to me that, oh yeah, here are these amazing sources that have been neglected all this time.
So you have this lifelong interest, and then you decide that you will tell the Gospels according to H.L. Hicks. And then you have this year in which you do research and writing day and night. What were your dreams during that year?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I could take dreams in two ways.
Yes. Well, tell us both.
Yeah. And I think my dream life is, I seldom remember my dreams when I awaken. But it is, I did have an active dream life during that time period. I think probably because of being intensely involved in a project, and at a couple of time periods being in different physical spaces, at these residencies, and so sort of physically being in different surroundings. But in terms of what were my dreams in the project, it was there's a dream of a sort of revised understanding, or a revised sense of this material, sort of one wants to reinvent oneself by writing. One wants to reposition oneself in relation to the world and to one's life experience. And so I think that was my...
That happens with every book, doesn't it?
Uh-huh.
But it seems like this one is a book of service.
Yes.
Did it feel risky to you?
Yes, absolutely. For various reasons. My extended family, let's put it this way, do not share my religious disposition. And so it makes things very awkward in relation to family members. So in that sense, if not quite risky, my extended family is generous, and they're not going to kick me out or something like that. But it's an imposition of this sort of reminder that that there's something, we see things very, very differently. So from that sort of from that sense of risk to it is a kind of challenge to, whole institutions are insist on a certain understanding of what the gospel is and where it resides, and so it does seem to me that this is a kind of challenge to something that's a very rigid, large structure in the world.
Well, you did say it. We are not allowed to do that now. We're not allowed to question that now. And you did that. And normally there is a price to pay. Have you read Nikos Kazantzakis and The Last Temptation of Christ? A brilliant book. Right. What happened to him? He was excommunicated from the church.
Right.
And I did say that I personally, grew up in an atheist country. And, when I read that book in my, teenage years is when I actually said, oh, okay, this is real to me. I could actually believe. And that was because it came to life.
Right.
And it was the opposite of doing the faith a disservice, but because it was non-canonical, he was excommunicated.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'm teaching a class this semester on ignorance and disinformation.
Okay.
And so, I'm excited about it. I've got some marvelous students in the class, and it's turning out to be a very interesting investigation. One of the things that we're really observing for one another in this class is that we have a kind of baseline understanding about communication, according to which it's all about the truth. And so I'm speaking to you now as a disinterested speaker my only motivation is to communicate truth to you, and you're a disinterested listener, and your only motivation is to discern, to distinguish truth from untruth, and to embrace truth and dismiss untruth. And a part of what we're observing for ourselves in this class is that sort of idealized vision of communication doesn't bear very much relation to reality, but we're motivated as speakers and we're motivated as listeners. And what we choose to believe really has very little to do with what a disinterested observer would identify as the truth. I'm motivated to embrace a belief because it identifies me with a community that I want to belong to.
Right.
Or whatever the motivation is, but the motivation really doesn't have much to do with the truth. And so a part of what that's very intense in the political realm, and very intense in the religious realm.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's very hard to be impartial in politics or religion.
Yeah.
Would you read us a little bit from the book?
Sure, yes. So I should mention before reading that there will be one thing that'll be unfamiliar in the sound, and that is the pronouns. So one characteristic of this book and the translation is that I tried to make all references to God and to Jesus ungendered. And so it will refer to, when it refers to Jesus, rather than saying he, I'll pronounce it G. So it's not he or she, either one. It's spelled X-E, and I'll pronounce it G. And so I'll just read it. This is the first couple paragraphs, and then I'll skip a couple and read a couple more. So just right at the beginning. I attest here to the habitation of G who is among and within we who would be. In the age of the soul will come the human who knows the great power. G will receive it and know it. G will be sustained by the mother's milk. Speaking in parables, G will proclaim the age to come as she spoke to Noah in the age of the flesh. With every word she uttered, she spoke in 72 languages. With her words, she opened the gates of the skies. She humiliated the overseer of the underworld, ending his rule by raising the dead. And then I'll skip a little bit. Those who understand what is presented here will become graceful. They will be graceful because they understand truth. Those who have followed your, who have labored in their homelands will find rest in the skies. They will journey, repeating your words at will. But look, everything that is to be has happened already. At the origin was the Word, and the Word was of the God, and God was the Word. At the origin, it was of the God. All began through it, and without it, nothing that did begin began. In it was life, and the life was the light of humans. The light shines through the darkness, and the darkness cannot contain it. Humans, seeing images, see by the light, but don't see the light they see by. Humans see the lit, not the light. This is the gospel of the sought that seekers seek, the completion given by the Father's mercy. Through the hidden mystery, Jesus, the salve, enlightened those who were in the darkness of forgetting. Your light revealed as a path the truth she taught. She teaches those willing to be taught, the living written in the book of living. Those willing to be taught are taught about themselves by the Father to whom the teaching turns them.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Who is this book for? Who is the audience?
we'll see. But my I think what I'm imagining as the audience is people who have at least a couple of sort of common features in their backgrounds with my background, some prior interest in Christian religion, either from background of, brought up in a church, from a culture in which church was actively present, some kind of prior interest, but a curiosity about sort of what that might look like, loosened a little bit from the most familiar institutional structures. So people who are maybe have some kind of reservation or skepticism about the institutions of religion, but are interested in the possibilities of some resonance or meaningfulness to religion that might not correlate exactly with institutional structures.
The book is coming out now. Can you show it to our listeners and describe the cover also?
Yes. Yes, this is, oh, sorry, I've got my little placeholder in here. So here it is. I think that this shows the whole thing on the screen.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a fabulous cover designed by the fabulous people at Broadstone.
Mm-hmm.
And the cover image is actually extends, doesn't show very well, I'm sure, on the screen, but the cover image is not confined to the cover, it wraps around some. And it's a work of art by a former colleague of mine, Piper Shepard, who is a fiber artist. We knew one another when we were both professors at Kansas City Art Institute, and she's now at the Maryland Institute College of Art. But she makes these, normally makes these very, very elaborate cutout pieces of large scale with tiny, delicate cutouts that make these beautiful shapes. And this particular piece is an image of pins arranged in this format. And so what I resonated with for that image, and again, the video might not communicate because it's very fine image with these very fine pins that compose the shape. I didn't want a traditional religious image. I certainly didn't want, in a translation that uses non-gendered pronouns, I didn't want an image of a bearded male Jesus.
Right.
I didn't want something that was a kind of literal representation of some sort. And the way I was reading this image in relation to the gospel, and no one else is obliged to interpret it in this way, but I was very interested in the ways in which these individual pieces, the push pins themselves, they're placed in such a way that they create this image that's not like the individual pins themselves, and yet they create this larger thing. And so I felt like that there was some analogy between what I was doing by gathering pieces and trying to arrange them, I felt that there was some kind of a very, very loose analogy that so that it made this circular image resonate for me.
Thank you, Harvey. I want to ask you about your poetry now. I want to ask you about Rain Inscription, your latest book. When did it come out, first of all?
It came out in 2000 and when did it come out? 2017? I think that's right.
So fairly new book.
2017. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about it and read us a few poems. I would love to learn about the poet, Harvey
Right.
Hicks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's actually in this book a very strong connection with the gospel. In some ways, it's a sort of predecessor. Rain Inscription is in sequences sort of that each exists on its own. And so one sequence is a sonnet sequence in which the titles are questions that are themselves quotations from books that I was reading at the time that I was composing them. The poems. And so then sonnets are made sort of in response to those questions. I took them as questions, as if they were questions being asked me. And so that's what those titles were. The second sequence is translations of ancient texts. And so I'll come back to that in 1 second. And then the third sequence is about architecture. I've had an extended, very active, formalized conversation with a long-standing friend who is an architect. And out of that then came this long poem that uses architecture as its sort of basis for understanding. So that's the scheme of the book. And then I'll just mention then one thing about this middle section. One of the translations in the middle section is a translation of the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, ancient Greek philosopher, usually referred to as a pre-Socratic philosopher, one of the people who obviously came before Socrates. And I've been interested in him for a long time. And so this is a translation of his fragments. And what I've done with them is all we have from Heraclitus are these little fragments scattered around. Aristotle quotes him sometimes and so on. And they're usually presented as fragments. And so I tried to make a single poem, a continuous poem out of them. And then the other translation is a sayings gospel. So one of the things that we now scholars now understand about the process of formation of the canonical gospels was that the earliest gospels that were written down were just collections of sayings that were attributed to Jesus. So they didn't tell the stories about Jesus' birth, and they didn't give the genealogies, and there weren't lots of miracle stories and stories of the crucifixion and so on. It was collections of sayings that were attributed to Jesus. And those got passed around, and then other things got added to them. So people then started telling about miracles and so on. And so what I tried to do was to recreate my own sayings gospel by compiling from the sayings gospels that either exist, such as the Gospel of Thomas, or that people postulate based on inference from existing other gospels. And so that's what that is for. Sorry for the world's longest description of a poetry book.
No, this is really good. You said that there are three sections. Read us a poem from each section. That sounds fascinating. And then after that, I'll ask you about Greek, about you and Greek.
Yeah. So let's see. Here's a poem from the first section. How about this one? Let me find just the one that needs to be read here. So here's one. The title is, let me make sure that I get the attribution right for the title here. So the title is a question that originally comes from a book by an author, Shani Mutu, called He Drowned She in the Sea. That's the title of her book. And so the question, it's actually two questions, is why would I see she what you mean? So you can tell from the title of the book that vernacular is used in the book. So those were the questions that I took for myself. Why would I see she what you mean? So I wrote a love sonnet. I see she surface, see she dive. I see she reckless behind the wheel. I see she hustle, jitterbug, jive. I see she several, many, all. I see she coinage, comma splice, solecism, and a coluthon. I see she shore scan for sea glass, cold wind here be damned and cold rain. I see she camo, target practice. I see she jungle cat, carnivore, 5 speed, 426 Hemi. I see she soda, here she fizz. Now, after all what came before, I see she see me, see she see.
That's a novel.
So that's an example from the first section. And then here's just one stanza from the Heraclitus translation. This is just the last stanza. To speak with mindfulness, one must embrace what all share in common, as strongly as a city embraces its laws. All humans are subject to the encompassing divine law. It rules unconditionally. It suffices always and is prevenient. No exemptions. Though most pretend to private understanding, Logos binds us all. How hide from what never sets? Explore every avenue. Still you will not discover the limits of a soul dilate with Logos.
Wow, that sounds like an epigraph to the class that you're teaching now.
Yeah. He's so, Heraclitus is so interesting. I have a book that I want to write, and I'll never get where I can, but it would take as its a sort of original, as its starting point, something from Heraclitus, who one of his very short sayings is that much learning does not teach understanding. Mm-hmm. And the Greek words there are Polymathia and noon. And so the word noon is what is usually translated understanding. It's one of their words for like a kind of wisdom. There's a contemporary philosophical term, noesis, that comes from it, noetic, the noetic, but it's about a rich understanding. Polymathia is, if I could show it on somehow show it on the screen, it would be easily recognized because we get an English word straight from it, polymathy, and so it's mathia, the word that gives us mathematics. That's a particular kind of understanding, a kind of structured understanding. And poly, the prefix that means many. So polymathia could be translated big data. and so so here's this ancient philosopher who's saying big data is not the same thing as getting it.
Absolutely. And you know, it's really important to keep on translating and translating and translating a text, because that brings it to in our contemporary world and makes it relevant to our lives, especially
Right.
timeless things like such as what you just said, what you just
Right.
read.
Right. There's those points of, there are of course a great many differences across time and across space, different contemporary, different cultures and societies, but also very strong commonalities, and finding ways to recognize the wisdom that ancient cultures had acquired, even though their context might have had many differences, and the wisdom that other cultures in our own time have that comes from their histories. Figuring out how to draw on that wisdom seems to me a profound opportunity. You know, what a gift to be able to draw on experience that extends beyond my own experience. And exactly what you're saying seems to me to be one of those ways to do that. Go back and look at these people who saw something about their world that a lot of people at their time didn't see. Okay, I want to look at my world with what they saw in mind.
Well, what does it mean to draw on? To me, that means to be able to apply it, you know, and that's exactly what the passage that you read refers to. You know, you hear a lot of information. If you cannot apply it, you cannot transfer knowledge into wisdom.
Right.
It's not usable. If
Right.
it's not usable, it's useless.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we get very preoccupied with knowledge. It's very important. I'm preoccupied with knowledge myself. We should all be.
From morning till night. Knowledge all the time.
Yes, absolutely. So hooray for knowledge. But bearing in mind what you've just said, bearing in mind that knowledge by itself, it's not enough. It's just as ready to lead us down a bad road as it is to lead us down a good road. It's just as ready to do something that's not in my self-interest as to do something that is. So knowledge by itself is incomplete. It's valuable when it's made valuable by its conjunction with understanding, wisdom, noos, what Heraclitus term. And so I, become frustrated in a career in higher education with the propensity, because knowledge is measurable, it's the thing that becomes the basis for evaluation and so on. But it's very easy for the institutional structure of the university to repress or lose sight of or just ignore it's not only ancient philosophers who pointed out. I mean, I think of someone like the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen, who observed we don't, as economic agents, we don't only apply given values, we're able to assess values. We can choose our values. But part of what that means is we don't just apply knowledge. We decide what we're going to do with knowledge. We decide what knowledge we want to pursue and acquire and so on. And so figuring out how to keep that live in oneself seems very important to me.
And I read somewhere once, and it changed my view on a lot of things, but that learning more, the more you know, the more responsibility you have. Because it's one thing to not know something and to act in a certain way. It's completely different thing to choose to close your eyes to certain information.
Right. Yeah.
So if you know that there are more gospels than just 4, and then you don't write a book about it, then that's a choice.
Right.
And then when you choose to write it, then you know, I happen to know that there is a very big and sometimes steep road between writing something and deciding to publish it. That is yet another step.
Right. Absolutely. Yes.
So read us another poem from the book, from the 3rd section.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So this is. Let's see. Actually, I'll just read the very beginning of the. Read the first couple of stanzas of this very long poem. I'll spare you the whole long poem, but this is the first couple of stanzas of it. So this is the first portion of a poem called "Toward an Architecture of Unstable Structure." Then satisfaction. Name me a feeling more skittish. Affection? Hardly. Resentment? Torpor? A cotton for array, for even trigonometric weave? None of the above. Never mind love. Satisfaction, like a wolverine, claims territory with pungent, lingering musk, leaves carcasses, paw prints, scat, but for all that is not itself seen, much less captured. Cannot survive in captivity, will not breed there, would not breed, could not survive if it could be captured. Name something more sidelong, less settled, more silverine, more alert to multivalence. Name me anything more marriage fragile, glass fated, so slightly off register. Then whose feelings are my feelings not more muted? Then whose marriage was my marriage not more mutely lost? Name me a confederacy so sidelong and southerly, so sassafras, more muggy and mosquito-chevied. As buildings need not look like buildings and sometimes don't, so feelings need not feel like feelings, and mine seldom do. Even stable structure is not susceptible to capture. How much more elusive then, the fleeting and soluble? what scarred the scene but only haunts the silver gelatin, invisible, present by implication but as nothing. Buildings no more look like buildings than feelings feel like feelings. My marriage looked like marriage the way glass looks like glass.
So lovely. What are you writing now, Harvey?
I have a couple of things sort of live. And so one is a scholarly book, a academic monograph about the 19th century British novelist George Eliot, famous for The Mill on the Floss and Middlemarch and so on. And she's a fabulous, wonderful novelist. And the book is for a series that Penn State University Press puts out called Religion Around. And so there are volumes so far in this series, Religion Around Billie Holiday, and Religion Around Virginia Woolf, and Religion Around Emily Dickinson, and so on. And so mine will be Religion Around George Eliot. And I'm working on a prose book that I'm calling the Disparamentalist Manifesto. And so I, in email conversation with a friend at one point a while ago, the friend just said as a kind of closing, how are you feeling? I'm feeling experimental. And for some reason in my head, my head just made up this term. Well, this was during a political moment that I was not thrilled with. This was during our current presidency. My head immediately said, I am feeling disperimental. Mm-hmm. And so I just began trying to think about the term seemed to me to capture something that I'm interested in and that I think we all feel, that I want to do something to help make the world I envision happen. But the other forces are just bigger than I am. and so things are going to take a shape that doesn't much look like how I wish things were. And so I'm caught in this position of wanting to do something, but being powerless to make it happen. And I think we're all in that situation, whatever our vision of how things should be, we're all in that situation. Well, and so I'm
whether aware or not aware of that, we are in the situation.
Right.
So so you say it's prose, is it essays or fiction, short stories?
Yeah, there's a little short manifesto, kind of 20 bullet point item manifesto. And then I try to expand on it some more. And I'm just asking friends to contribute things too. And so there's one of the sections will be other people thinking about this problem and redefining the term disperimental and so on. And so it'll have not just my trying to use this term to think about the situation, it'll have other people also contributing and thinking about it in that way.
Very interesting, like a dictionary term with different sources.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah.
I want to ask you about the titles of your poetry books.
Uh-huh.
Just going from the one that you published, from your first to your latest, Perfect Hell. God bless, legible heavens. You know, I'm just reading the ones that have, you know, words like heavens, God, and hell in them.
Right.
How did you decide to do that? I'm asking for a friend. No, I'm asking for myself because I wrote a book called How God Punishes, and in the United States, nobody read it. There it is. So,
Yeah.
and I think that in
Right.
very big part it was
Right.
because of the title. And you started with Perfect Hell. And how did that work out for you? And because I see that you continue doing that. I mean, even your latest is the Gospel According to H.L. Hicks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think probably part of it for me is that there is a connection for me just in terms of personal history with the language of religion generally, and especially the language of Christian religion, because this was, you know, it's the first context in which I heard language offered as a powerful medium, in which the sermon, for example, was presented as this, in the Baptist churches that I was raised in, the sermon had a formal structural quality to it. And there were forms of speech such as prayer that were, you know, I was presented with this form of speech, prayer, in which I was talking with God. And so the context in which I first experienced language as something that is more powerful than I am, something that can put me in touch with stuff I can't get in touch with without language. That context was church, was Christianity, it was the Bible. And so that remains very, even though my religious beliefs are very different now from what they were in my childhood, but that experience remains very strong for me of, okay, the context in which I got it, that language is powerful, was church, it was religion. And so that I think that has stayed with me through my writing of poetry. You know, many of the poets who were important to me when I was first exposed to poetry. When in college, I was, you know, in introductory literature courses when I was being introduced to poetry. So the first poets that I fell in love with, many, John Donne, Gerard Manley Hopkins. So the poems also themselves were explicitly religiously, the language was explicitly religious language. So I think in terms of personal history, there's an origin story there for me that has continued. But the part of the lasting power of it for me is that I am interested in this, the very broad concern of being a little critter in a big world, and being a relatively powerless entity in the middle of forces that are much bigger than myself. And so people name those forces in different ways and understand those forces differently. But a Greek tragedy talking about fate and a 19th century Puritan preacher talking about sinners in the hands of an angry God. I guess that's 18th century, wasn't it?
And not only.
Yeah, but they're both of them are talking about forces larger than ourselves that have power over us, to which we are accountable. And so I'm fascinated by that. It seems to me a brute fact about human existence, that we can, none of us ever escape from it. We might fool ourselves or whatever, but we never escape from this human situation that we all share. And so I think the titles probably reflect that.
Yeah, what I have found out when
as yours does, right? How God punishes is.
It felt like I would be out of integrity with the work if I give it a different title. Yeah. And I just had to do it. I want to ask you about translation. So do you translate from Greek and from Lithuanian and from other languages? And you translate poetry. So first of all, let me ask you about Greek. Do you translate from Greek?
Yes. Ancient Greek.
Okay.
I don't speak and wouldn't be able to translate from modern Greek. But ancient Greek, yes.
Okay.
Though that's a late, as you well know, languages are much more easily acquired as a child. And of course, speaking them and so on. And I only learned Greek in graduate school. And so I'm a latecomer, and as Greek translators go, let's just say I'm on the low end of the scale in terms of competence. I'm not. Any classical scholar would affirm that my Greek is terrible. But
I'm sure your Greek is great. I started studying English in college, and you use it and you practice, and it works for you. And hey,
yeah.
What about translating poetry?
Yeah, and so the translations from Lithuanian and from Estonian I do not speak either language. I couldn't hold a conversation for a minute and a half in either Lithuanian or Estonian. But I have worked with wonderful colleagues who are fluent in both either English and Lithuanian or English and Estonian. And so the process has been that they will present a literal kind of translation into English, and then I flip through my, depending on which language, of course, Lithuanian or Estonian dictionary, and make sure that I get the gist of sort of what's going on, and then try to think of this in as a poem, trying to get as much as I can from the literal. So it's a very mechanical process in the sense that I don't know either language well enough to just be able to sort of read through the text on the page. I have to look up, what is that word? What is that word? And so it's very much a partnership. I wouldn't be able to, from Lithuanian or Estonian, either one, I wouldn't be able to work by myself at all.
And here is a language. No, here is a question that I ask all my guests. Actually, I asked this question to all my guests who teach creative writing, but I think it's a general question for you, because I know that now you teach philosophy. So what is the most important thing you teach your students? If there is one thing that you want them to remember from your class? What is it?
That one becomes a better writer only by becoming a better reader. Yeah, that we learn. Yes, I'm surely dealing with my own personal experience, but the way I learn to express that such that other people, so that a reader might engage with it, is by looking at how other people have dealt with their experience. And so they've drawn on formal structures and so on, narrative patterns and all of that. And so the more of this that I absorb, the more patterns I'm picking up, and the better able I am then to deal with my own experience. So if I were going to just condense just one principle, it would be good readers make good writers.
Thank you so much, Harvey, for coming on Accents and telling us about your latest book, The Gospel According to H.L. Hicks, published by Broadstone Books. Thank you for reading poems from your books. Thank you for talking to us about translations. There is so much more I want to ask you, and I'll invite you to another interview when the next book is out.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for this conversation. It was beautiful. Thank you.